where the heat is.
Okay, fantastic. Will one of you guys be able to do time signals?
I give it to the spectator. He has the app.
Oh, amazing. Okay. In that case, I invite the Prime Minister to deliver their address, not exceeding 7 minutes. Whenever you're ready.
I know this is close to like the description. This is not necessarily representative of my personal opinion.
Excuse me.
Bless you. First, give me a moment.
When they make countdown, like 3, 2, 1.
Sorry. Is the panel ready? Cool. Start the speech in 3, 2, 1. It is important to note that the values that we have on either side of the house not necessarily are the values that are to be upheld the most. This is to say, we are taking the decision from a neutral standpoint under the veil of ignorance. This is to say, for instance, valuing liberty more than valuing the agency is not something that necessarily applies. We need to justify why is it likely that one is going to be like better than the other. For instance, like suggesting that a more like a freer life is better intrinsically, something that is not applicable to this debate. Why do we believe it is better to live under this island? First, I'm going to characterize how the lighting up probably looks like. Why is that problematic? Then, why do we have more happiness in our side of the house? First, note that the vast majority of the world currently lives under the line of poverty or extreme poverty. This is to say, in all likelihood, provided the fact that that it's random who where I am going to live, there is likelihood, high likelihood, that I'm going to live under a situation of poverty. We believe that this is problematic due to several reasons, provided the fact that I have probably more suffering, probably face discrimination, etc., out of this particular thing. We believe that this is something that is intrinsically worse. Furthermore, there are also other forms of violence that I have my experience. This looks like, for instance, like particular gender-based violence, or like racialized violence, ethnic violence, etc., etc. The fact that those conflicts exist in the status quo, and the fact that I have no control of where I'm going to be born, suggests that there are instances in which I might be born, for instance, in like a war-prone country, or like being part of an ethnic minority, etc., etc. Therefore, suffering from the consequences that derive from this particular situation. We believe that this is something that is intrinsically problematic. Furthermore, we believe that climate change is something that is incredibly problematic. This looks our generation already suffers a lot from climate change. We believe that the problem with climate change is that those instances are usually like incredibly harsh in the way it damages individuals. This looks like damaging crops, like erasing the places in which these people live, literally kill them out of like extremely sufferers' death because of the way in which climate change affects them. We believe that this is not problematic in and of itself for the reasons that I've already enlisted, but also because these changes are usually irreversible. This is to say, if my land disappears, provided that climate change is likely to continue to exist, there's no way in which I can repair that. Therefore, the suffering that I would get from like the problems derived from climate change are bigger on the other side of the house. We believe this is something that's intrinsically problematic. Furthermore, we believe that the problem is that climate change also affects individuals that are not vulnerable. This is to say, even if you buy that statistically I might be born in a middle-class country, in a relatively well-off country, I'm still going to suffer from climate change due to the fact that climate change affects like the biosphere probably as a whole. This is a like incredibly rare opportunity to not be affected by climate change. Climate change is already affecting countries that are significantly well off, such as Canada, the US, etc., Europe. We believe that we are likely going to be affected by it, but yes, opening.
The info slide says no climate change related disasters will occur during your lifetime. What about non-climate change related disasters?
Yeah, those are likely going to occur on our side of the house. The thing is, in all likelihood, that is more prone to happen on your side of the house. And since I have no control on where I'm going to be born, I may be born in a country that is also going to suffer from climate change and all the other additional disasters that might also exist on your side of the house. So on your side of the house, assuming that we have risk, you have both of them, we believe that is something that we should not credit. How does the conception of a good life look on the government side? We believe that we have more happiness for three things. First of all, sense of community. We believe that we have a stronger relationship in your life, and notice that this is incredibly profound. provided the fact that we are defending our community so much, we are likely going to feel like closer ties to our community, which then suggests that we have more access to like eudaimonical like happiness, provided that we have closer ties to our community. We believe that having better relationships is something that is likely going to yield into like better results in terms of happiness. Also, we believe that we have more agency. Look how the fact that this creates a more accessible sense of purpose. The comparative on the other side of the house is someone else dictates what is like your happiness, which we believe is something that is intrinsically wrong. But if not, and if you have like enough agency for you to dictate your own happiness, we believe that this is incredibly excruciating and exhausting for the individual to figure out what makes him, her, or they happy. We believe that's something that we should not abide by. We believe that even if on our side of the house, you also try to compel with like societal structures, is the fact that the fact that you don't have epistemic access to the things that you could have had on your side of the house provides that we are likely going to be more happy on our side of the house. This is to say, even if I am unhappy, the fact that I have no capacity once I am born in the island to recognize that I might have get into Harvard, that I might like land this particular job, suggests that I'm not going to feel sad if I do not accomplish that, which then suggests that on our side of the house we have more access to happiness, or at least we are not as unhappy if we are like unsatisfied with the situation we are currently in. But also we have more agency towards, or more sense of agency towards what we particularly do. This is to say, in the opposition side of the house, if we face violence, if we face discrimination, etc., we are unlikely to be able to act against this because it's 1 against 1,000, whereas on our side of the house, it's one person against 10. So probably we have more agency to contribute and to actually have an active voice in our society, therefore belonging incredibly more. We believe that's something that is also beneficial on our side of the house. Also, we believe that we have more stability and certainty. Generally, these groups are unaffected by external shocks. So, because like this community actively tries to prevent this, which then suggests that our life is something that is more familiar. We believe that familiarity is something that is like really important. I'm going to impact that, but yes, first closing.
Would you rather be born in 1700 or today?
Depending, like even if I can recognize that there is like more advanced medicine today, that we have like access to technology, more flow information, etc., you can't control whether you are going to be born in that particular country that is being benefited by those like as bad men, or you are going to be born in like a poor country that is currently under colonial conflict. Since you can't control that, and the moral arbitrariness can determine where you're going to be born, and you are likely to be born on the last, like on the bottom of the scale. We believe that choosing to be born in an average like place that is going to guarantee you that you're going to have stability, that you're going to have agency, and that you're going to have a sense of community, even if there is likelihood of having a happier life or like on your side of the house, the fact that that is uncertain suggests that we should prioritize what the world of proposition suggests. We believe that on our side of the house, the fact that we have a certainty suggests that even if your role is unchanged, since you don't have epistemic access to know what other roles you could have performed, you are unlikely to be bothered by this particular situation. But certainty then allows you to explore other spiritual or other like more fundamental things, because you don't need to worry whether you're going to eat or not. You need to worry to make money, for instance, because you have those things covered. Therefore, you are more likely to have a more spiritual development and also access happiness to that particular means. That can only sit on our side of the house. Really proud to propose.
Okay, I think that's speaker for their remarks, and I invite the leader of opposition to deliver their address, not exceeding 7 minutes. So if you're ready.
Here.
Starting I would start by talking about pain and happiness, because I think really the premise of the opening government case is that it is worth it to endure intense pain, and I'll go on to explain why I think they do endure intense pain, for a semblance of happiness, or at least for the absence of unhappiness, the absence of comparison, or the absence of some form of hedonic treadmill. And I think as a way to imagine this, I just want you to imagine, would you, for instance, go through 5 to 10 minutes of the most nightmarish, intense pain you possibly could, if for the rest of your life you were guaranteed no discomfort or no sense of moral, unfulfillment? Surely not, right? I think the bias that the vast majority of people have, and the bias that the average reasonable voter should have, is to avoid intense pain, intense discomfort at all points in time. two things then in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why a life with greater comfort is better and why we deliver it on our side. And then secondly, I'll explain why it's better to have agency and we should maximize it. Firstly, why a life with greater comfort is better. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just provide a series of reasons to believe that the world is pretty good. I'll note that this clashes with the characterization we get from opening government to suggest that, obviously if you're born randomly, you could be born in a conflict zone, you could be born very poor. A few observations. The first thing I want to note is that all of their reasons why it is unpleasant to be born in a war zone or to be born in a place that is poor are just reasons also why it's even worse to be born on the Sentinel Islands. Like, if it is the case that deprivation is bad and you should avoid it, guess where there's a lot of deprivation. If it's the case that exposure to the elements or lack of access to education and infrastructure is bad, that is only worse on the Sentinel Islands. So I think all of their arguments, which are like, well, the standard of living is imperfect, or, climate change might make your standard of living worse over time, should be evaluated with reference to the kind of life you live on the Sentinel Islands. The second thing I want to note, though, is just that the world is experiencing unprecedented material wealth. Gains in productivity and technology have made it easier than ever for people to do things. Many people, and increasingly exponentially so, can do things like access the internet, like buy flights, like migrate, like get service jobs and so on that are world expanding. And I would note that I think this is a time actually of relatively limited conflict because of things like strong norms established that prevent war and where it occurs, manage it. Which is to say, yes, obviously the world is imperfect, but the world is pretty good. It has a series of joys available to people. And even in the very worst case, you have things, for instance, like a built environment, like the capacity potentially to access the internet, like, for instance, a strong community that isn't just 200 people and has had the capacity to trade and have input from elsewhere, that is likely more forward-looking, that likely just involves more people and gives you far more opportunities. I think there are a series of reasons then to believe that counterfactually, the Sentinel Islands are particularly bad. Firstly, they just have extremely limited infrastructure, which means that you are every day at the mercy of the elements. And I want to note, maybe something the government will say is like, but you don't know any difference, so you don't mind it. But of course, I think that this is a visceral sort of discomfort that you cannot avoid, which is an innate sense of discomfort. That is like, you have pain receptors in you, and they fire, and so you feel pain, which means that you cannot avoid it, or it is non-relative. It is something you feel in and of itself. And I think the easy way to illustrate this is just that at every opportunity where humans have had the ability to innovate their way out of pain, or to avoid pain in whatever way, they do so. Secondly, though, you just have no access to creature comforts, like medicine, like education, things like that, which, of course, again, maybe you don't know about, but I would note that I think you do know the feeling of nausea, for instance. You do know the feeling, potentially, of wanting more than whatever it is you have on the island, and wondering what that could possibly be. And finally, I would note that the risk of death that you experience is just so incredibly high. They can see that there are natural disasters on their side of the house. I have no idea what you do when a cyclone comes to your island, which means that even if you believe that, in the very worst case, if you're born in a war zone, and if you're born in the Sentinel Islands, and you have a brutal life on either side, I think it is very likely, in almost every case, that your life, at least on their side, is shorter. You get less of it. Okay, I'll take a point now from C.
Do you think those fancy little dogs that live in rich people's houses have better lives than like the noble wolf that strides the wilderness?
I don't think that is comparative, but I also think they definitely do. Like, they get to watch TV and stuff. So that's nice. Yeah. Also, they go to the hairdresser. Like, it's awesome. All right. Why then does comfort matter? A couple of things to say. I think it matters in and of itself. As I've described, comfort is something which is innate, biological, visceral, which means I think it is, it is not neutralized by potentially being non-relative. And I would, actually, you know what, I've already done this in fact. You're far more comfortable on our side of the house. That rules. We like comfort. All right, now I'm going to talk about agency. And I just want to start by outlining the set of choices available to the average world citizen. But actually, I'll take a point from opening.
Yeah, if not having medicines is excruciatingly painful, if you're not going to access medicines on either side of the house because you can live in a place that has not, the level of pain is higher because you know that medicines exist, but you can access them.
No, it's not higher. Like, the pain doesn't come from knowing that medicines exist. Pain comes from the pain receptors being irritated, right? And and also, if you live in a place where there's other stuff to do, even if it's relatively basic, you have things that can distract you. You have a community which has more developed norms around managing pain, etc. So even if you can't access medicine, it's still better on our side for a huge set of reasons. All right, why is it better to have agency? A couple of things to say. Firstly, there are just a bunch of choices which are available to an average world citizen, and admittedly not everyone, but on average, you've got a pretty good shot of getting access to them. Those are things like increasingly migration, things like education, things like having a sense of international community. You really just need a bit of data every month, and you can access ideas that you have never encountered before, and that give you possibilities that you could not imagine. The impact in here is firstly that this is happiness expanding. Maybe it is true that you avoid some unhappiness on side opening government, but you also avoid a vastly more amount of happiness, because giving people choice, giving people the ability to establish their preferences in the first instance, is something which creates the possibility for happiness in the first place. But additionally, this provides people with moral fulfillment. That is to say that agency is something which allows you to help others, something which the vast majority of people care deeply about. Being able to be altruistic, being able to leave the world better than it was when you were born into it, is something that means a huge amount to people, a sort of fulfillment you can never get when you're constrained to an island. What do they tell you? Firstly, they tell you, well, you have to figure out what makes you happy in our world, and that sense of confusion or frustration is very hard. You never get to do that on Sentinel Island because you have no possibilities or no counterfactual available to you. They say, you compare yourself to others, or you have a hedonic treadmill. Well, first of all, I think this is likely innate, like maybe you just compare yourself to another guy on a Sentinel Island basis rather than a Sydney basis or whatever. But additionally, I would note that if it is true that comparison can yield unhappiness, it's also true that it can make you happy. It can give you a sense of fulfillment when you finally get something that you wanted for a long time. It can give you a sense of fulfillment when you realize in some way how lucky you are. Having a world that was expanded was always a good thing. So,
Okay, I think that's the year for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver their address, not exceeding 7 minutes, whenever you're ready.
7 minutes 15.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah.
Before I begin, I just want to say sorry to Aditya if the Breaking the World analysis is ridiculous. Let's start. 3, 2, 1. The response is kind of disgusting to just appeal to the things that you as probably rich people or people that live in the West have. But for the vast majority of people, it is a life of poverty. It is a life of aspirations that are never met, and it is a life of potentially dying trying to achieve dreams that the world never actually allows you to achieve. I just do think that the vast majority of individuals have a family member that, just statistically, have to go through that because the healthcare system wasn't enough, who might be bombed to death by another power, that in many instances don't have enough capacity to go up the ladder that opening opposition is talking about. And that prospect in life is very, very excruciating. Our point was not that you're fucking confused when you're trying to look for happiness, is that it destroys you mentally. And what I'm going to make incredibly clear is that you have a profound sense of agency on our side of the house, that life is not easy, but that the moments of happiness and comfort are a lot better for you, and the way you internalize them is incredibly, incredibly important to you. The first thing I will note is in terms of material comfort and the whole pain analysis that I think is quite simple. The first thing to note is that it is empirically true that these communities are a lot more preventive, and that external shocks, such as for disease-wise, are way fucking less. You do not have Western diseases going in this island. In most instances, you do not have a lot of contagion. That means that most of these people are incredibly strong. Most of the people in these communities have very, very good immune systems. Most of the people in these communities do not live to 80, it is true, but I don't think that they ever explain to you why that is intrinsically bad. I do not understand why a 100-year life is way, way better than one where you live 80 years, or where you live 70 years. But I want to make it clear that these people, most of them, the elders in these communities, do live to be old, and I just do think that in general, these are people that can rest a lot more. The vast majority of people, there's probably 6 to 7 billion of the human beings that exist right now, have almost no time to significantly rest their minds throughout their lives. And I just do think that happens on our side of the house. And I want to make it clear that the time period matters, right? When these communities were being built, and when these communities were facing a lot of clashes from the people that were trying to go in, it wasn't easy, right? But at this point in time, which is when the motion happens, these people have a lot of fucking time to rest, because usually what they do is they get enough for them communities, but then they conceptualize their lives as profoundly forward-looking, right? What I have to do is serve my community, but as long as I do that, I would be able to have time for my own. Compare this to literally the vast majority of people who do not derive a lot of happiness from spending hours in traffic, or potentially knowing that if you don't work enough or work 3 jobs, you're not going to feed your child and they're going to die. Our side of the house is comparatively better when you have a lot more rest, when you have a lot more stability, and the very ridiculous response in opening opposition is you are contingent on the climate.
if you have food for the entirety of the year, as the info slide talks about, then it probably isn't that bad to you. And what is empirically true about these communities is that they're generally quite stable in terms of the relationship to the environment, because they live in a geographic part of the world that is not as inconsistent. Opening.
Yeah, so your claim is, in spite of material deprivation, Sentinelese people make choices and form societies in ways that allow them to feel happy. Why is it the case that other people in experiences of violence or material deprivation can't do the same thing?
To be clear, it is because the expectation is not there. But it's not just like, oh, you see other people being happy. It's the system indoctrinates you to want those things and you don't achieve them. But the other thing is, like, that point of reference just doesn't exist for these individuals, right? The very, very strong point of reference is in helping other individuals. And I want to make it extremely clear. The most significant relationships in these people's lives are continuous over their entire lifetime. You forever, for every day in your life, can relate with your brothers and sisters, with your friends. You can have, like, you can play games with them. You can form relationships with them. You can talk to them about things, or like communicate with them about the things that are most significant to you. And I don't think that you necessarily have that in opposition, at least for a subset of the population. And I just don't think that the lives that they talk about are as good as they make them seem. Because they just appeal to you imagining that these things are good, right? They say, at least you can travel. Why the fuck do I want to travel? Like, the vast majority of people in the world will never actually get in a fucking plane. That is just empirically untrue. But also, right now, as a person that is middle class in Mexico, I don't suffer from the things that I don't have, that I could not get. And I just generally think that in the vast majority of instances, the people in this island wouldn't either. I also want to make it clear that the lives in the best case scenario of opposition are lives of suffering whenever comfort reigns. That is the reason why people in Japan kill themselves in many instances. Sorry for the lack of trigger warning. Whenever they just have to work for their material lives without finding significant meaning. On our side of the house, you get indoctrinated into finding purpose on this, right? And because these jobs aren't particularly hard, in the vast majority of instances, your point of reference of the highest dreams you could get, i.e. being the best gatherer, being the best father, being the best mother, being the best brother, are quite achievable. And so the response in the opening opposition that you're gonna be hedonistic towards the other homie in your community is quite ridiculous, right? You are able to beat them, or at least you're able to get quite close to them. Closing.
You say the goods of modern society are very hard to achieve, but you just assume that the goods of the Sentinelese society are very easy to achieve. Why is that?
That was the entire case, but I will continue saying this. The point here is, I also do think that on our side of the house, the community provides you with a lot of certain conditions. And I also just think that you have a main character syndrome, right? Where you can feel like you own your life a lot more on our side of the house. Where you can feel like you can impact others, and these are to be clear, not just the people, but the entities, i.e. things, people, like themes within your life that you can affect the most, right? I feel like I can do the biggest impact to my brother, to my sister, to my mother, and I can actually make their lives materially better. And that is profoundly mentally stabilizing. It is profoundly mentally enriching. And so the main response that I would give to the closing up POI is the following. I generally think that these people grow up throughout 30, 40, 50, 60 years in life, believing that all they have to do is to maintain the community. And because there are potential threats, which empirically haven't actually affected this community, but they might be perceived as threats, you have a profound sense of defense. So you feel very, very close identity-wise to this community. You feel like you have to defend it. You feel like you have to fight it, for it. And that gives you a profound sense of purpose, which in many instances is achievable. The last thing that I want to talk about is about this whole characterization and opening opposition on the potential for other things. And I want you to scrape our characterization on hedonism, right? Assume that most individuals have the capacity of finding better lives on opposition. I just generally think that the life of stability that you get in opening government is comparatively better. When you never have to question yourself how you're going to potentially solve for the problems in your life. Like, problems just aren't as pressing because you understand that you have a lot more time to rest, because you have a lot more time to build relationships. And these are generally the things that give the most pleasure and utility to individuals. What is empirically true for this round is that you're going to live a stable life on our side of the house, even if you're not going to live the longest life. On side opposition, there is a good chance that you get bombed. There is a good chance that climate change kills your family. There is a good chance that you don't get to 60 because the current generations aren't going to the way climate change is going. There is a good chance that you lose your environment to climate change. And that is the case that they don't actually respond to. Stability and your conceptualization of it is what matters, and we're proud to propose.
Okay, I think that's eager for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to deliver their address.
Everyone ready? Great. The failure of open in government is to rely and over-rely on the info slide. They say there's no food insecurity, so you live a life of rest and leisure where you can participate in games with the community. No, it's not coconuts falling down from the sky. The reason why food insecurity does not exist is because you spend every minute of every day foraging, hunting, doing whatever you can to earn your keep. The same way that they say that you live in the current status quo in the current system. The problem, I think, with open in government is that they are just woefully over-reliant on a characterization that says everyone lives to whatever age they think we live in the North Sentinel Island. Everything is probably pretty good. They don't suffer disease. Their immune systems are really strong. And I have no basis for what this empirical reality lies in. I'm going to prove to you structurally why the life is pretty terrible. But before anything, I want to talk a little bit about moral obligations. I want to talk about why you have them, independent material that says that it doesn't matter whether or not you're better off as a North Sentinel or better off anywhere else, or the moral obligation you have is to opt into a system in which you are born in anywhere else in the world. And I think the reason is because you have moral obligations to others that are constructed by the value of almost any form of construct you consider. Family, to help those with less, broader social constructs. And I want to be clear here, that even if you, quote unquote, as a North Sentinel person have, those moral obligations to that is not the question. The question is who you, as a person making this choice, as an actor in the motion, have a moral obligation to. You who has the ability to make this choice between living as someone random in the world or someone in the North Sentinel Islands. Even if this obligation ceases to exist in a philosophical sense the second you are reborn, you, making the choice, have this obligation right now. That choice always pushes you into being on our side. That is because any form of agency that you have is impossible in the North Sentinel Islands, and you are limited in scope. The size of the population, the risk of generational collapse, all those sorts of things that I think are, you're not going to, maybe at best on their side, you have some small chance of helping 150 people, the total population of the North Sentinel Islands. I think anywhere else in the world has a much higher impact. And I want you to just think about this from a distributional sense, right? I think on the lowest form, people who have literally nothing are still able to help the people in their community the same you would on their side of the house. And people who have everything are able to help tons and tons of people. And this is probably pretty good, but independent of whether or not you are actually able to help people, the point is that you should opt into choosing whether you're able, whether you're potentially likely, whether you're able to make these moral obligations. I just think on a probabilistic sense, you're likelier to be born in the richer half. But even if you aren't, the fact is you are unlimited in the number of people you can help on our side, you are limited on their side. Moral obligations, I think, incline you to vote for us. The second thing, life as a North Sentinelese person. It is unclear to me why these communities are democratic and equitable. It is unclear to me why, quote unquote, the DPM says, there is empirical reality of people living and having immune system diseases. Do you guys know what sepsis is? I don't care if you don't have malaria or something like that. You get one cut on their side, you're dead. I literally do not know how you avoid this. Do you know the thing that 99.99% of people have on our side of the house? Antibiotics. People in conflict regions have antibiotics. People all over the fucking world have antibiotics. You know where they don't have it? The North Sentinel Islands. Opening, salvage your case.
One extra life in a community of 200 people makes a huge impact, which means you have a moral obligation. On your side, in many instances, if you're forced to be poor, forced into violence, forced into capitalism, clearly we beat you on your own half-ass principle.
No, I think this is not true. And the reason why is because, yes, to be clear, if you're a North Sentinelese person, obviously, to you, 1 out of 200 is big, 1 out of 7 billion is very fucking small, and you are not making the decision as a North Sentinelese person. You are making it as you, the actor in the motion, that is opting between helping being a North Sentinelese person or not. And I think the difference here is, as that person, you should consider everyone's lives equally. You should not consider the lives of one North Sentinelese person that much more, which means any of their moral obligation stuff doesn't matter there. North Sentinelese lives suck. They're patriarchal. I just think you should draw any sort of evidence from what you think of early tribal history from the Europeans, the Polynesians, the Indians, anywhere else. These places are patriarchal. They are the strongest rules. They are dynastic. And I want to be clear here. You're talking about an island where 150 people still live after millennia. They're subject to all sorts of genetic diseases from inbreeding or anything else like that. I just do not think they give you real mechanisms as to why these people are not the fucking Habsburgs on steroids. But it does not matter. Because what does matter is you are just devoid of any form of ability ability to meaningfully live your life past the age of 30, to meaningfully live your life past the age of 40. Congratulations, you get food security. The second you get a cut, you're probably dead. Ellie tells you all of this. No response at DPM. I want to be clear about why these communities are bad. This is structurally likely to be true for several reasons. One, they are not agricultural. These are small islands where people are hunters and gatherers. So there's no form or meaningful engagement for people to for people to have actual community relations that are not built around your ability to kill animals. Like, that is the most defining trait. That is always what means that the strongest rule. There's no outside forces motivating change, no exposure to outside views, and crucially, we do know that these people are quite violent, and the way you know this is because anytime someone shows up at their borders, they spear them, they kill them. Like, I don't know, this happened 6 years ago. Obviously, this is likely to be the case. And I want to be clear here as to why this is the most important thing. Their only good argument, in a sense, is a probabilistic argument. They're like, you are likely to be born into conflict, which I think is unrealistically true. Compare that to their best case. Maybe 20% of the chance you're likely to be born into someone in the good life, living the good life in the North Sentinel Islands, like the chief or their family or anything else like that. That is a far lower chance than you actually have to live a meaningfully stable life on our side of the house. I think is super important. I'll take closing.
Yeah, the net moral impact of people who don't live in North Sentinel Island is substantially more negative than people who do. They emit more emissions, they exploit people through economic systems. That's the moral difference,
I
not
think
an abstract question of agency.
All of this should suggest that the North Sentinel similarly exploit people. I think the emissions thing is unclear. There are no moral obligations when it comes to that stuff. The point is, as an individual, you're likely to be able to think you can help people, and you do help people. The vast majority of people do actually try to help people in their daily lives. I think you should intuit this whether or not you try to do this. And I just think the average person who is moral would want to try to do this. I think that's fine. So, here's the problem. One, you still suffer from disaster, but it's far worse because you have no resistance to floods or anything else like that. You have houses on our side, you have huts and leaves on their side. I just think you are far worse. You are more exposed to extreme weather elements. All the stuff that Ellie said to you, independent of climate change, I think wins the debate because you will die at the age of 30. Maybe you'll make it to 40, maybe you'll make it to 50. I really doubt you'll make it much further. They can't just say empirically it is true because structurally and logic-wise, you should consider the fact, one, the fact that we don't know anything about these people means that you should be able to make structural arguments about what it is likely to look like. Obviously, those arguments are likely to say these people are not very happy. Life in the world is good. Globalism, global redistribution means that you're likely to get, pretty good standards on almost any side of the house. There's a significant rise in comfort and productivity to the point that I think someone born today is likely to live in pretty good situations regardless of where they live in. The revealed preference argument from Ellie, people choose to not work in subsistence agriculture. People choose to have AC. Obviously, people choose to have these comforts even though, even when they know they don't need to have them. I think the climate change stuff is out of the debate.
Okay. I think I've figured their remarks, and I invite the member of Dog to deliver their address. Whenever you're ready, please.
All of the agency that opening opposition talks about isn't just something that exists in a vacuum and comes from nothing. It actually comes from other people, it comes from the earth, it comes from animals, it comes from the environment. And that is a problem for them. Because what we will explain to you at closing is that all of the moral obligation material that they have is actually incorrect. That in fact you have a moral obligation to choose the most minimally impactful life you possibly can. A life that does not rely on exploiting other people, on exploiting the environment to the same extent that you would if you were born in literally any other context. And a life that does not involve you often doing things like extracting resources in contexts where those resources are not just scarce to begin with right now, but are likely to become vastly more scarce as climate change gets worse and worse. The last thing we'll talk about is comfort and satisfaction, but I think that that's less important in this debate. So why is this particularly important in terms of the moral choice, and why is that moral choice the most important issue in this debate? The first thing to say here is that any arguments that are made around your individual happiness or satisfaction or your individual subjective life experience are just ones that are incredibly difficult to prove or believe or even impact in this debate. People experience the world in vastly different ways. People in particular contexts and cultures and communities experience the world in vastly different ways. Everyone is often born with a fairly unique sense of ideology and values, and they like different things. And all of that means that the odds of your particular values matching your particular context and you feeling like you are living a life that you think is good and comfortable is actually just quite random and unpredictable. unpredictable. It's unclear if being born into a rich Western household is the thing that would make you feel happy. You can look to the fact that things like mental illnesses in those contexts are often extremely high. You can look to the fact that people in those contexts are opting out of having children because they think that they're about to put them into a life that is not worth living because of things like climate change, because they are part of a system that is exploitative and that they don't believe in. And I think you can also just look to the fact that often, even in those most privileged areas, people feel a deep sense of emptiness about their life. They often feel a deep pressure to do things to remediate that. That's why you see the explosion of things like effective altruism. Because people are crying out for a way to try to make their life better, to try to make themselves feel better about the fact that they're at the top of a system that they know is wrong. But the same is true for people at the bottom of that system as well. If you're born into an area where you have very little agency, you're still subject to things like forces of oppression. You're subject to things like governments that oppress people around you. You're subject to being born into a culture where you're raised with particular ideologies and bigoted beliefs and particular prejudices, and it's incredibly difficult to actually unpack those, to move past them. It's likely that you will do harm to other people, and it's likely that you're often going to do things like, at minimum, be complicit in terrible evil structures, but often in many cases explicitly support them through working for those companies, or through doing things like voting in those governments, or through doing things like, for instance, perpetuating unjust systems where your ancestors seized somebody else's land and you're not going to give it back anytime soon because you need it. And the important thing here is that obviously for the people who are born into those systems, they don't have a choice. It's not like their lives are immoral, but choosing actively to be born into any of those circumstances, when you could instead choose to be born into the North Sentinel Islands, is an immoral choice. You ought sacrifice the comfort and the pleasures that opening talks about, and instead opt into a life where you know for certain you will not be harming other people, and in fact, your presence is likely to be just an unequivocal boon. So let's talk about that and what it looks like. Why it is a particularly good thing? I think what's important to understand here is that in the context of the North Sentinel Islands, your presence as just an additional person is just unqualifiedly a good thing. You can look at the fact of you can look at the aerial surveillance of this area and the satellite imagery to know that there's a large amount of land that is available and unexploited. There is not, for instance, like an absence of food on, and that's given to you by the info slide, stuff like that. Resources are actually relatively abundant in this context. What you need is more people to gather those resources such that your community is able to have greater surpluses and to live in greater certainty and safety. And I think that what's important here then is that that just means that you know that your presence, regardless of your ideology, regardless of your beliefs, regardless of whether you have bigoted thoughts, whether you have immoral thoughts, your day-to-day life of going out and gathering food for other people is unequivocally a good thing. Like, you are certainly, guaranteedly helping the people in this community. That is not true if you were born into the West, like, at all. It is not true if you're born into a middle-income country, where you're often propping up systems of oppression as well. And it's not even true if you're born into an incredibly poor context, where you're still feeding into things like unjust systems, where you're still often, as part of your day-to-day necessities, likely to be doing so. But it is true in this context, and almost this context alone. So you ought to choose to guarantee yourself that. And I would just suggest here that the kind of moral debt that anyone else is born into, like the fact that you are almost certainly likely part of some group that hurt a different group in the past, and you're not likely to be the person who changes that or rectifies it. The fact that you're almost certainly going to consume a product that was created by a corporation that did things like exploit the land, or did things like exploit workers, or did things like coerce others and remove their agency. Like, all of that just means that your day-to-day life is one where you are always doing harm to others to at least some extent, and you have to struggle to make up for it. On our side, you know for a fact that you are born into the world with your hands clean, that your day-to-day life is one where your hands are clean, and that in fact, every single time you do just the ordinary things that every North Sentinelese does, go out, gather food, build structures, care for people who are sick, things that every member of communities like this are expected to do and would be expelled for if they didn't do it, you are just helping people every single day. You absolutely should choose this, and to not choose so would be, I think, extraordinarily wrong. So let's talk about why it is that you're actually likely to have, I think in kind of many respects, a somewhat more comfortable, or at least a sufficiently comfortable life. But before I get to that closing.
Where in the info slide did it say these people don't steal, abuse, mistreat others, or act in any of the immoral ways that humans have always acted in lots of these societies?
Yeah, so it's just
like
like a
Papua New
probability
Guinea
thing, right? Like, in every society there are some people who for whatever reason like steal or abuse, but that's obviously very unlikely, and it's kind of equally likely no matter where you were born. What is unique here is that, yes, you have an equal chance of maybe stealing from somebody, but you're definitely not participating in the systems we are concerned about. Yeah, opening.
CG's extension is the same moral argument as the good place, and it doesn't work for the same reason. Because the small harms, e.g. emissions, that you get are infinitesimally small compared to the benefits that you have to be able to help people. By their logic, if you choose not to enter these systems and not break them down, you are equally complicit in allowing them to persist.
I don't think that's true. Like, I think
the thing is, this team just kind of neglects the idea that like North Sentinel, like they themselves prove that this is one of the most desperate, like disprivileged, place where people need the most help possible. And I think by like literally kind of depriving the North Sentinelese, I guess, of an additional person, like that is opting out of helping a group that this team should be really concerned about. All of their material on their principle and their moral obligation is to explain that you have an obligation to help other people. And we tell you that you will certainly fulfill that obligation to some extent on the North Sentinel Islands. They rely on a very uncertain claim that you will actually make up for all of the moral debt you incur alongside your agency. And the greater agency and power you have, the greater your moral debt is, because that agency and power came from other people fundamentally. So the more of it you have, the greater your burden is to actually make up to it and come into a net positive sense. That's why it is incredibly difficult to do so on their side. And I think it's just why a lot of the most powerful people in the world are fundamentally miserable. It's why a lot of them buy into weird ideologies. It's why a lot of them don't want to have kids or reach for straws, like they'll become vegetarian or something like that instead. None of that is anywhere near as effective as what we tell you you should do. We flip this claim. It's by far the most important. This is the only moral choice.
Okay, I think that's the end for their remarks, and I invite the member of government, or sorry, the member of opposition to deliver their address whenever you're ready. In the famous oft-repeated philosophical experiments, people are offered two options. You can live in a perfect life, perfect partner, perfect kids, everything that you would want, but it's a simulation and it's fake, or you can live in the imperfect world and know the truth. And people almost always opt for the truth. There is something remarkable about being in a situation where you can challenge and dislodge the assumptions that you think you have, choose one that you think is ultimately the most true possible thing, and then instead of having some sort of scripted identity, opt into, by virtue of your own agency and your own virtue, the right path that you think suits you. We're going to be extending by talking about the importance of truth and finding the truth, which is so much harder in a place that is so isolated, talking about why we believe that some of the improvements in quality of life for humans will be massively accelerated thanks to many technological interventions, and then refuting. So what we would argue is that when you're in a place where there's no awareness of the outside world, you have a very small homogenous community, you attack people who visit, I think we've all accepted this is a shutout society where you don't have access to other ideas. We'd argue that even in some of the poorest and most destitute parts of the world, you still have a larger array of ideas. Perhaps you hear of different religions. Perhaps you see different oral traditions or histories. Even in some of the most remote parts of Africa, people will be aware of things like colonization, for example. You'll participate in different forms of arts. You'll hear different languages. You'll be able to interact with people who are different from yourself in ways that you simply cannot on this island. What this does is it gives you the unparalleled opportunity to figure out what is true. We'd say that this is critical for two reasons. One, you can figure out who you truly are. If you cannot conceptualize something like gender identity because you've not been exposed to that idea, if you cannot conceptualize something like women and their equality because you've not been exposed to that idea, you cannot then figure out how you relate to that idea and how much of that is true for you. That makes it difficult for you to live in alignment with what you would believe your higher purpose is or your true identity is in a very meaningful way. More importantly, on the sense of morality, it's so important for people to know what the right morality is. That's why people are constantly poring over literary texts, over religious texts. What was really meant by this? What did God really want us to do or who we should be? If you cannot pick the right morality by challenging your ideas, by hearing different ideas, by simply getting more at-bats in terms of questioning if something you have is wrong, you cannot truly call yourself moral. And finally, absent many opportunities or paths to be yourself, there is no way for you to actually say you're moral or ennobled in some way. Part of ennoblement is actually picking a path that you did not have to pick, but you did pick. So if you are a martyr on this island because you've been told you're a soldier and you simply have to be, it's very different than if you opt into a war you did not need to fight. You opt into a social battle for a group that you did not need to defend. There's a certain type of self-actualization that we think is absolutely critical for individuals to feel like they've had a good life. Many people are sick, many people are poor, but on their deathbeds what they often say made their life important was the choices that they made based on the truths that they discovered, and you cannot discover that if you live within a dark and clouded box. Closing.
Why do you presume that a culture that has survived since, we literally don't know how long continuously, lacks the richness that you describe and lacks the ability to access a variety of different ideas about how to live in that society and what is important?
I would argue that There's certain things that just add diversity that you will not have in a place that has very, very few people and very little exposure from the outside world. You're not going to get tons of different religions, tons of different languages, tons of different traditions. We have 7 billion unique people in this world. There's a very high likelihood you're going to get a greater diversity of ideas from these individuals than others who have a very scripted life with like 6 different jobs that you do on this island, and none of the diversity that we've seen from the progress of human civilization. Why do we think life will be better today? I think we're different from opening half, and that they're just saying, look, there's antibiotics, and you know, opening gut is like, well, you know, not everyone has antibiotics. Look, the world's going to get crazy better in the next few years for a few reasons. The things that make our life bad are health concerns, our labor concerns, and issues with sustainability, all of which we have reason to believe will be drastically minimized over the coming years. AI has advanced so much that soon we'll have technology that can solve a lot of our biggest problems. Robotics started just in 1837, for example, where you had steel plows, and now we have most of agriculture being automated. Amazon can detect and move individual items very easily. We're talking about a lifetime where we could see bridges built, for example, with AI, or oil spills wiped out. That's a lot of the worst and most degrading labor that we can replace with technology. We see things like quantum supremacy in computing solving a lot of health issues around precision medicine, modeling proteins, in ways that can actually solve a lot of the diseases that we didn't think we could solve. And we further see massive changes in energy. We believe solving nuclear fission is something we can do in our lifetime. That's possibly infinite energy. It used to be $4.80 a watt in 2000 for solar energy, and in 2019 it was $0.38. Scarcity is what makes a lot of these unnecessary instances of suffering that we've heard in this debate happen, and we're not going to have that same kind of scarcity of labor or energy in our lifetime. That means that if you're born today, by the time you're my very old age, you're going to have a very different life than even some of the most destitute communities in society have now. Yes?
Most scientists in the world say that the climate can't change by more than 1.5, and the current trend is over 6 degrees. The comparative in this debate is not the status quo or potential alternatives in all. It is a world of trying to survive to people dying from climate change, and they haven't engaged with opening culture.
We feel very optimistic about being able to turn a lot of that around. Again, absent any crystal ball, we have to assume the kind of crazy exponential amount of progress that we've seen, and I've named a lot of the technologies that will get us there. We believe we can make algae that consumes carbon in this lifetime, proteins that can clean pollution in this lifetime. And a lot of scientists, yes, are not very bullish, but they also don't understand a lot of these technologies, and a lot of those very pessimistic assumptions have been replaced with things that we've done in this lifetime. We've seen AI and robotics actually stop armed killers, for example, which we never thought could have happened in Dallas, even though it has. And so I think we need to pay attention to that level of optimism and see that it has a place in this debate. Also, we see that in general, a lot of these technologies trickle down. There's a commercial benefit, there's a lot of structures in place built by democratic governments, such as patents that expire, and ultimately there will just be no need to force people to work if you can get it done otherwise. We think there will be massive distribution, which again is a trend that we see continuing. In terms of reputation, I think we largely heard from closing that, you know, you're necessarily a good person for living on this island, despite that we know that many of these traditional societies, which we studied in places like Papua New Guinea, have huge amounts of sexual abuse, cannibalization in some places. It's just not clear that you're necessarily helping your loved ones in all cases. And again, you don't know how moral you are because you haven't been exposed to any other ways of living or what morality could be. We think that it's just not reasonable to think, look, well, at least I'm having a negligible ecological impact. All of us are having a negligible ecological impact. We live in a world of 7 billion people. It's just not a huge impact in the debate that you have one more person potentially littering the New York City metro. We'd also say when you talk about the idea of a good life, material benefits, I think a lot of this was implied reputation in my debate. If you do not choose to help your family, and if you do not know the truth of whether or not helping your family is good, you didn't do the right thing. You did the only thing you could. And we don't think that's as meaningful as picking what you believe the right thing is, and for that you need truth. Proud to oppose.
Okay, I think that's speaker for their remarks, and I'd be Keith Gubwich to deliver their address whenever you're ready.
Am I good to go?
Yeah.
I want to begin with CG's contribution to the opening half, because it's the most direct way for us to be all three up teams in this debate. Because opening government is right when they say that the spectre of climate change dwarfs quibbles over the rate of development of artificial intelligence or the availability of slightly better housing over slightly worse housing. Because all of those things will be underwater, people will be displaced, your life will be measurably worse than one where you're protected from the worst of those harms. CG's contribution to this will be to mechanise why climate change will not be prevented under the government bench. That is to say, why it is a certainty that the average person born in the world of not North Sentinel, which per the infra slide is likely to be insulated from those effects, will actually be displaced, will have their food insecurity spike, will have their home put underwater. And if we can mechanise that, which is something OG fails to do, it is clearly the biggest harm and the biggest change in the debate. What are the 4 reasons why climate change will not be averted for the average person born in the world today? The first reason is that the decision-making structures which are responsible for making that action are not aligned with the interest of preventing climate change. That is, domestically, short-term election cycles, whether they be 3, 4, or whatever years, do not capture accountability for long-term trends like climate change, which explains why governments tend to prioritise things like short-term economic performance rather than a temporary hit to your industry's competitivity in order to, in the long run, make a green transition. But secondly, it's even internationally. Collective action problems exist where states can very rarely enforce carbon reduction agreements amongst each other, which explains why no one state wants to take the first step of taking the hit to their competitivity, of reducing their economic productivity in the short term in order to secure the long-term security of the planet biologically. But it's secondly for the reason that the interests which profit from climate change, that is the main drivers of climate change, large corporations, fossil fuel companies, so on and so forth, have an outsized influence over those structures of decision-making and power. Which is to say, even if you think those structural problems can be averted, the actual decisions that are being made are being tainted for the worse. They engage in practices like lobbying and donations to re-election campaigns, which have a much more direct impact on a politician's ability to continue to be in office than, for instance, pitching a long-run green initiative which doesn't immediately bring jobs to an area, which doesn't immediately get them re-elected in a way which makes them unlikely to ever make the long-term decision over the immediate benefit before them. It's things like corporate capture, which offer generous jobs like directorships and a huge number of benefits to politicians which choose to stand by fossil fuel companies to allow them to continue to pollute and engage in the harmful practices which exist at the moment. And it's things like the social connections which develop in halls of privilege between power brokers and the leaders of highly pollutant companies and fossil fuel companies, which then play out in the halls of power where those decisions are made worse. Thirdly, we point out that the most powerful people tend to be insulated from the worst forms of climate change, which reduces their interest in addressing it. That is, these people are in the most wealthy jurisdictions, with the most ability to build sea walls, or pour billions into developing drought-resistant crops. These wealthy individuals hoard resources for themselves, make sketchy investments into water rights and the various ways that they themselves can escape climate change without having to make the decisions to take the action which will protect the average person, the person that the government bench says we should be born as. And it's finally for the reason that much of the technological development, which CEO says is our get out of jail free card, is not being directed to climate change, which has a tenuous impact, which has a huge impact on social goods, but not property goods or private goods. That is, people are far more likely to pour AI research or technological development into finding more efficient ways to trade on the stock market, or uproot Google search or ChatGPT, things which are much more directly profitable, though not good for solving the problems before us. That analysis explains why the person government says we should be born as is likely to be displaced, is likely to suffer from famine, and is likely to have their home underwater. OG correctly point out this is bad, and much worse than even the most backwards and most basic forms of life, where at least your basic food security is guaranteed, and your aversion of those harms is guaranteed by the infra slide. But we're the side which actually mechanize that change, mechanize that difference, and explain therefore the biggest harm. Before I move on, closing.
There's a commercial interest for many other parties you didn't mention to do things like innovate in terms of clean energy or clean up, and there's a lot of dollars earmarked for that so that you can have a more regenerative and clean society. Can you engage with that as well?
The burden of saying it could be profitable to develop a cleaner form of energy is so high. Like, you need to explain that these things occur despite all the trends I've just described, quickly enough that meaningful changes are made, and distributed widely enough that people who are poor will be able to access it. Because that is the person you are likely to be born as, not someone who lives in the US or Australia or whatever. That contribution alone, I say, takes the debate for closing government. But secondly, we also provide a principled extension, which explains why the only moral decision is to choose to be someone born on North Sentinel Island as opposed to anywhere else. The challenges we get to that are a couple fold. The first thing is that people on North Sentinel Island behave badly, they murder each other, other or steal from each other or whatever. But I want to point out the evidence for that claim, that the life we live is also immoral, is extremely shallow. They're just like, well, they throw spears at drones and basic lives lead to abusive structures, like might is right. But that characterization is extremely unintuitive. Due to the burden of living like a pretty basic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you are required to engage in pro-social behaviors in order to survive, to cooperate with one another, to not undermine the very tenuous social structure upon which all of those means of accessing resources exist. The second challenge to our principle we get is individuals are not culpable for moral harms that we describe. Stuff like emitting like pollution as an individual or engaging in capitalist structures which are exploitative. And that is true once you are living that life, but it is not true in the context of this debate, where we sit behind a veil of ignorance and have the ability to choose whether to live that life or whether to live a life with far fewer harms, where you have a much lower impact on other people. We have the capacity to avert them as the actor in this debate, which ordinary people do not, which creates the moral distinction we say is important. Okay.
It's not clear that you actually add to the population on either side. So emissions are morally symmetric, but as an individual, you gaining agency is asymmetric.
Yeah, no.
Dan's 4-minute whip session on climate change doesn't matter, because we can adapt, they still get extreme heat. That sucks.
No, the issue isn't population number, it's pollution. Like as someone in North Sentinel Island, you don't engage in industry or ship goods across the world. Your average person does in order to get the antibiotics and houses you say are important. This contribution is debate winning. It's the most certain consequence, like the common thread across all the lives these people say are important, is participation in globalized economies. It's the emission of greenhouse gases, things which are notably, certainly, and clearly harmful upon other people. But secondly, given that you have a base moral obligation to reduce the harm you inflict upon others, which is fairly intuitive and an axiom in debating, you need to believe your life outside of North Sentinel Island is so much better that it's worth making the immoral and harmful decision on other people. And given the material we provide in response on climate change, it is just unclear that these people get to enjoy antibiotics or houses built from stone rather than leaves for very long at all. Given that context, make the moral decision, stand by the other people on this planet, and refuse to engage in exploitation of the rest. For those reasons, proud to govern.
Okay, I think that's eager for their remarks, and I'm going to opposition whip to deliver their address and close up this debate whenever you're ready. Does anyone else find it cold in here?
I'm freezing.
I don't know if there's a window.
I have a I'm just getting difficult.
Yeah, a little warm.
Yeah, I'm gonna come.
These debates about the good life are always difficult, so I just got to ask you to introspect. What Gov are asking you to do is to lock your moral values into something that you actually think is good, and at best, because of some cost-benefit analysis based on what you think today. What we say or not is that the fundamental to any good life is that life being real and authentic and being lived in accordance with what you really think correct values are. That's what's needed for the life to be good for you. It's also what's needed for that life to be good for others. Following a moral code isn't good if that moral code is incorrect. Atrocities have been carried out in the name of the good. You've got to get the good right. You're most likely to get that good right if you expose yourself to change, you expose yourself to new ideas, and you allow that future version of yourself in 50 years' time to be a much better person than whatever you think the moral truth is today. I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to look at the critical value of exposing yourself to new ideas and allowing your moral views to evolve over time. Then I'm going to look at this opening half clash about material conditions of life and show how Debbie's analysis about technological change dramatically tipped that balance in Ops' favour. So first of all, on the good life. So Debbie gave a bunch of reasons why views, look, we're not saying it's perfect, but views are able to evolve over time in most societies. what are they? One, you have more conceptual resources. You may be someone who's slightly female presenting. The idea that gender was different to sex only emerged in the discourse, like, decades ago. When you have those things, you're able to see the world in a new way, change the way you think about things. Two, you just, are more likely to be exposed to other people. Even in autocratic countries, you've got the internet where you can read, watch TV from lots of different places, see lots of different cultures. Three, just on their side of the house, they're defending a culture which, look, none of us know much about. The only thing we know pretty much is that they're somehow immune from global warming, and that they really hate outside cultural influence. The distinctive thing about this people is how much they shut off change from the outside, and presumably that means from the inside. If these people hate foreign ideas, they're going to stop the revolutionaries trying to upend their society. That means you're going to get much less moral debate, much less moral challenge about whether their way of life is good. And yeah, we accept like not all places are going to be helpful. As I say, we think people in autocracies aren't going to be able to make as quick progress. They've still got the internet. Autocrats eventually fall. We think they're much better off on the comparative.
Point of information.
Why does that matter? I think the critical way this weighs in the debate, first of all, is that even if we conceive this gov idea, that in the Sentinelese you've got this wonderful life where you think you're great, you just help your